Can you believe I ended up in a full-blown suburban war over a handful of chickens, where a single cluck turned me into an unlikely rebel? My name's Ryan Harper, a 35-year-old software developer who traded a cramped Portland apartment for a fresh start in Cedar Hollow 7 months ago. What started as a quiet dream quickly spiraled into a battle I never saw coming, and it all began with a knock that changed everything. If you think HOAs are just about lawn rules, buckle up, this story's about to get wild. I had always dreamed of a simpler life, one where I could raise my own food and honor a promise I made to my late mom. Growing up, she'd taught me how to care for chickens, her laughter filling our backyard as we named each hen after her favorite historical women, Clara Barton, Ada Lovelace, Florence Nightingale, and Grace Hopper. Those afternoons were my sanctuary, her gentle voice guiding me through every step. After she passed 3 years ago from a sudden illness, I was left with an empty apartment and a vow to keep her tradition alive. Moving to Cedar Hollow wasn't just a new home, it was my chance to reconnect with those memories, to feel her presence through every egg laid by my hens. Little did I know that dream would soon be under threat. Cedar Hollow is an HOA-controlled neighborhood in Portland, a place where every hedge is trimmed to perfection and mailboxes match like soldiers in a row. When I arrived, I saw potential beyond the rules. I saw a backyard where I could build a life. So, I constructed a small chicken coop, simple but sturdy, for 4 Rhode Island Reds, Clara, Ada, Florence, and Grace, named after Mom's hero. These hens weren't just livestock, they were my way of keeping Mom close, each egg a fragile link to her laughter and lessons. For 8 peaceful weeks they clucked softly, pecked in their run, and brought a quiet joy to my days. I even started leaving fresh eggs on neighbors' porches, earning smiles and grateful nods from folks like Mrs. Jenkins and Peter down the street. Life felt good, until that knock shattered it all. The neighborhood seemed perfect, but beneath the surface a storm was brewing, one I'd soon have to face head-on. Then came the knock that flipped my world upside down. 3 sharp raps echoed through my quiet morning, each one sounding like a judge's gavel. I opened the door to find Helen Carver, Cedar Hollow's HOA president, standing there. Her brunette bob was razor straight, her smile colder than a winter night, and her emerald blazers screamed authority. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," she said, her voice dripping with judgment. "You're keeping unauthorized livestock. Those chickens violate Section 15, Paragraph 8. Livestock is banned." My heart skipped. I stayed calm, forcing a smile. I read that section. It only bans livestock if they cause noise or damage. My hens don't. They're quieter than the Thompson's beagle. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. This wasn't just a complaint. It felt personal, like she'd been waiting for an excuse to pounce. What was her game? Her eye twitched, a crack in her polished facade. "The board has decided chickens are livestock, period," she snapped. "Remove them in 7 days or face $100 daily fines." My stomach dropped, a cold wave washing over me. "Who complained?" I asked, my voice steady despite the panic rising inside. "Complaints are confidential," she shot back, thrusting a formal notice into my hands. The paper felt like a death sentence for Mom's legacy. My hens weren't just pets, they were her gift to me, a lifeline to her memory. No way was I letting Helen rip that away. I stared at her signature, Helen Carver, HOA President, Architectural Review Chair, Covenant Compliance Director, and felt a fire ignite. But her threat of fines loomed large. What would she do if I fought back? And why was she so determined to control every corner of this neighborhood? As she turned to leave, I knew this was only the beginning of a battle I couldn't avoid. After Helen left, I stood in my kitchen, the notice crumpled in my fist, the silence of the house pressed against me, broken only by the soft clucks of Clara and Ada from the backyard. Mom's voice echoed in my mind. "You're stronger than you think, Ryan." But strength felt distant now. I'd moved to Cedar Hollow to escape the grind of city life, to rebuild something meaningful after years of loneliness. Those hens were my anchor, a way to feel her pride when I handed out eggs to neighbors. Losing them wasn't just losing chickens, it was losing the last piece of her I could hold on to. My hands trembled as I thought of the fines. $100 a day could drain my savings, maybe even force me to sell. But backing down felt like betraying her. I paced the floor, torn between fear and defiance. What if Helen had more power than I realized? What if this was her way of targeting me specifically? Helen's visit replayed in my head, that cold smile, the way her fingers tapped her clipboard like a metronome of control. It wasn't just about bylaws. I'd heard whispers from Peter about her fining others for petty things, but this felt different. Her titles on the notice hinted at a woman who thrived on power. Was she building a perfect neighborhood to boost her property management business, as Emily once hinted? The thought gnawed at me. If she could twist rules to ban my quiet hens, what else could she do? I remembered seeing her sleek black sedan parked outside during late-night meetings, her voice carrying over fences as she scolded someone about a non-compliant garden. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was rewriting them to suit herself. My chest tightened. This wasn't a random complaint. It felt like a personal vendetta. But why me? What had I done to earn her wrath? I stepped outside, watching my hens peck in their run. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that hides secrets. Mrs. Jenkins waved from her porch, her usual warmth replaced with a cautious nod. Had Helen gotten to her too? Peter had mentioned fines for his umbrella, but now I wondered how many others lived in fear of her next move. Cedar Hollow's perfect facade masked a tension I hadn't noticed before. I thought of the eggs I'd shared, the smiles they'd brought. Were those neighbors now pressured to turn against me? The HOA meeting loomed in my mind. If I spoke up, would they side with me, or would Helen's influence silence them? The $100 daily fines weren't just money, they were a noose tightening around my dream. I could lose my home, the one place where Mom's memory thrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, my 12-year-old son. "Dad, are we keeping the..." His worry fueled my resolve. I couldn't let him down, or Mom, but Helen's power felt unshakable. What if fighting back only made things worse? The question burned. Could I outsmart her, or was I walking into a trap? As night fell, I sat on my porch, the notice glowing under the porch light. Helen's threat wasn't just about chickens, it was a challenge. I'd seen her glare, heard the steel in her voice. She wasn't backing down, and neither could I. But how? The bylaws gave me a loophole. Noise and damage were the triggers, but Helen seemed ready to ignore that. Was she acting alone, or did the board back her blindly? I thought of Emily's whisper about her property business. If she was using the HOA to pad her profits, my hens might just be the first domino. The idea of her watching my every move sent a chill down my spine. What if she escalated this? Fines, liens, even sabotage. I glanced at my coop, the hens settling in. They deserved better than this fight. My mind raced to Mom's words. Stand tall, even when they push you down. A plan began to form, reckless but bold. If Helen wanted a fight, I'd give her one she couldn't ignore. But would it cost me everything? I wasn't about to give up, not when my hens were Mom's legacy. Determined to fight, I knocked on neighbors' doors to see if my hens were really a problem. First stop was Mrs. Jenkins across the street. Her warm smile greeted me as she held one of my egg baskets. "We love them," she said, her eyes bright. "Those eggs are the best we've had. My grandkids beg for your scrambled specials now." Down the road, Peter and his wife Lisa were just as supportive. Peter leaned in, his voice low. "Helen's on a power trip. Last year she fined us for a non-compliant patio umbrella, said it was an inch too tall." I blinked, stunned. As I went door to door, a pattern emerged. Everyone had a Helen horror story. Fines for 2 reflective mailboxes, overly vibrant flowers, even a birdhouse labeled a nuisance. Most had caved to avoid her wrath. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just about me. Helen was terrorizing the whole neighborhood. But would they stand with me, or stay silent? Armed with support, I attended the next HOA meeting at the community center, ready to fight. About 25 homeowners sat in tense silence, their faces a mix of boredom and fear, as Helen presided from the front. Her gaze was sharp enough to cut glass, her emerald blazer a stark contrast to the beige walls. I stood during the open forum, holding photos of my coop. "My hens cause no issues," I said, my voice steady. "They're quiet, clean, and my neighbors can vouch for that." Mrs. Jenkins and Peter spoke up, praising the eggs in my care. A few others nodded, but Helen didn't budge. Her lips curled into a smirk as she cut me off mid-sentence. "Chickens are livestock, and livestock is banned," she declared, slamming the discussion shut with a bang of her gavel. The room went silent, her authority suffocating. I sat down, defeated but burning inside. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was playing dictator. How could I break through her iron grip? The next morning a certified letter arrived, its red urgent stamp glaring at me. I tore it open. Fines started Monday. $100 a day with a lien on my property if I didn't comply. My heart sank, a cold sweat breaking out. I couldn't lose my home over this, not the place where I'd rebuilt Mom's legacy. The weight of it crushed me. I sank into a chair, the letter trembling in my hands. That evening I sat on my porch, watching my hens peck in the moonlight. Clara fluffed her feathers, oblivious to the storm brewing. I thought of Mom's smile, her voice echoing, "Never let bullies win, Ryan." She'd fought her illness with every ounce of strength, and here I was, facing my own battle. Helen wanted to talk about noise violations. Fine, I'd give her one she'd never forget. My fear turned to fire. I wasn't just protecting hens, I was protecting Mom's memory. But how far would Helen go to crush me? The next day I drove 3 hours to a rural farm, my mind set. I met Gus, a gruff farmer with a wide grin, his overalls stained with years of hard work. "This is Stormy," he said, pointing to a Toulouse goose with sleek gray feathers. "Her honk can wake the dead. She starts at 4:30 a.m., guaranteed." Gus chuckled, his eyes gleaming. "Your HOA lady won't know what hit her." I watched Stormy strut, her beady eyes daring the world to challenge her. She was perfect, a weapon of chaos wrapped in feathers. I handed Gus the cash, loaded her into a crate, and drove home with a mix of nerves and excitement. That night, I set Stormy up with my hens, her honks already echoing in my imagination. I set my alarm for 4:45 a.m., barely sleeping. What would Helen do when Stormy unleashed her chaos? Would the neighborhood turn on me or rally behind me? The battle lines were drawn and I was ready to strike. Walking back from Peter's house, I felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by dread. Mrs. Jenkins' kind words warmed me, but her cautious glance toward Helen's house spoke volumes. Peter's story about the patio umbrella wasn't just petty, it was a warning. Helen had a history of bending rules to her will, and I was her latest target. I thought of Jake, my son, who'd begged to name the hens with me. "Can we keep them forever, Dad?" he'd asked, his eyes wide with trust. I'd promised him we would, but now that promise felt fragile. What if I failed him and Mom? The neighbors' support was a lifeline, but their fear of Helen was palpable. They'd been fined, harassed, silenced. Would they really speak up when it mattered, or would they back down under her glare? I sat on my couch, staring at the photos of my coop I'd prepared for the meeting. Those hens weren't just a hobby, they were my connection to a past I couldn't let go. I had to fight, but the odds felt stacked against me. Helen wasn't just a rule follower, she was a tyrant. Could I really stand up to her? The community center buzzed with nervous energy as I took my seat. The 25 homeowners around me avoided eye contact, their whispers fading as Helen walked in. She moved with the confidence of a queen, her heels clicking on the tile, her gavel resting like a scepter. I noticed a few board members, Margaret and Harold, shifting uncomfortably beside her, their expressions unreadable. When I stood to speak, my voice echoed in the tense silence. I held up my photos, my hands steady despite the pounding in my chest. "My hens are quiet, clean," I said, glancing at Mrs. Jenkins for support. She nodded, her voice firm as she added, "Those eggs are a blessing." Peter chimed in, "Ryan's a great neighbor." But Helen's smirk grew with every word, her fingers tapping her clipboard like a countdown. When she interrupted, her voice was ice cold, slicing through the room. "Chickens are livestock," she said, her tone final. End of discussion. The gavel slammed and my stomach dropped. Margaret looked down, avoiding my gaze, while Harold whispered something to her. Were they on my side or hers? The room felt smaller, Helen's power suffocating. I left with a fire in my gut, but doubt crept in. How could I fight someone who controlled everything? Back home, I reread the certified letter, each word a dagger. Failure to comply will result in a lien, it warned. A lien. The thought of losing my home, Mom's dream for me, made my chest tighten. I'd bought this place to give Jake a real childhood, one with backyard adventures like I'd had with her. Now Helen threatened to take it all. I stepped onto my porch, the night air cool against my skin. My hens were settling in, their soft clucks a balm to my nerves. I closed my eyes, picturing Mom's face, her warm smile, the way she'd brushed dirt off her hands after tending our old coop. "Never let bullies win," she told me once, her voice fierce despite her frail frame. She'd fought cancer with every ounce of courage, never giving up. I couldn't give up either. Helen thought she could scare me into submission, but she'd underestimate me. If she wanted to play dirty with noise violations, I'd give her something to really complain about. A plan formed, bold and risky. I'd show her what noise really meant, but would it be enough to break her grip? The drive to the farm was a blur, my mind racing with possibilities. I'd found Gus online, his farm a 3-hour trek into Oregon's countryside. Every mile fueled my resolve. Helen wanted a fight, she'd get one. When I arrived, Gus greeted me with a handshake, his weathered face creasing into a grin. Stormy strutted out, her gray feathers gleaming, her beady eyes sizing me up. "She's a force," Gus said, laughing. "You sure you're ready for her?" I nodded, picturing Helen's face when Stormy let loose. I handed over the cash, my hand steady for the first time in days. As I drove back, Stormy in a crate beside me, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about hens anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. I thought of Mom, of Jake, of the neighbors who deserved better. Helen had ruled with fear for too long. Stormy was my wild card, my shot at shaking things up. But the stakes were high. What if this backfired? At 4:30 a.m., Stormy delivered on her promise. Honk ha honk! Her cry ripped through Cedar Hollow like a siren, shattering the pre-dawn silence with a force that made my windows rattle. I smirked into my coffee mug, watching lights flick on down the street, one by one, like dominoes falling. Helen's modern craftsman home, 4 doors down, lit up like a Christmas tree. Oh, she was awake all right. By 5 a.m., my phone buzzed with a voicemail from her, her voice shrill and cracking. "Mr. Harper, that noise is unacceptable. Remove that creature now or I'm calling animal control and the authorities." I let her stew, waiting until a calm 8 a.m. to call back. "Morning, Helen," I said, my tone cheerful as I sipped my second cup. "That's Stormy, my goose. Her honk carries, huh?" The silence on the other end was golden. She was fuming, and I was just getting started. On day 2, I woke to a mess that turned my blood cold. My coop was tampered with. Feed scattered across the grass, a fence post sliced clean through with a saw. My hens clucked nervously, feathers ruffled as I surveyed the damage. Before I could process it, my 12-year-old son, Jake, ran up, his face pale. "Dad, I caught her on my phone. Helen did it." He thrust his phone at me, the footage shaky but clear. Helen in her signature emerald blazer, snagging on the wire as she fled into the dawn fog. My hands shook with rage as I watched her sabotage my hens. Mom's legacy. This wasn't just a fine or a rule anymore. This was war. Helen had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I saved the video, my mind racing with what to do next. She wanted to play dirty. I'd show her what I was capable of. That night, Peter knocked on my door, his eyes glinting with determination. "Stormy's chaos woke us all up. In a good way," he said, grinning. "Let's record our complaints about Helen. It's time she pays." Inspired by Stormy's honks, he rallied the neighbors, and by morning I had a stack of video testimonies. Mrs. Jenkins, the Thompsons, even Shy Lisa, all sharing their Helen horror stories. Day 3 brought a moment I'd never forget. Stormy chased Helen across her own lawn during a property showing, honking like a possessed foghorn. Helen dropped her clipboard, her heels sinking into the grass as she ran. Her clients doubled over laughing. I watched from my porch, trying not to cheer. Stormy was a hero, and Helen's perfect world was cracking, her facade of control slipping with every honk. But the victory felt fragile. With Jake's footage and the neighbors' testimonies, I had ammunition. But Helen wasn't the type to go down quietly. What would she do next? Later that day, Margaret, the HOA secretary, showed up at my door, her face tense as Stormy let out another ear-splitting honk from the backyard. "Ryan, the board split," she said, wincing. "Some of us support your hens, but this goose, it's a lot." I nodded, keeping my tone steady. "Stormy's temporary, Margaret, just making a point. Helen's the real problem," she sighed, glancing down the street toward Helen's house. "I know, we're reviewing everything." That evening, an email from the HOA's legal counsel pinged my inbox. My hens could stay, but Stormy had to go due to noise complaints. I exhaled, a wave of relief washing over me. Mom's legacy was safe, and Stormy had done her job. But as I read the email again, a knot formed in my stomach. Helen had lost this round, but she wasn't the type to accept defeat. I'd won, but what would she do with her back against the wall? After watching the footage, I pulled Jake into a hug, his small frame trembling with a mix of fear and pride. "You did good, kid," I said, ruffling his hair. "She can't mess with us now." His eyes lit up, but I saw the worry behind them. "Will she come back, Dad?" he asked, clutching his phone. I forced a smile, hiding my own uncertainty. "Not if we stop her first." Seeing Helen sneak into my yard to sabotage my coop made my blood boil, but it also lit a fire in me. This wasn't just about protecting my hens anymore. It was about protecting my son, my home, and the memories I'd fought so hard to keep alive. I thought of Mom, how she'd never back down even when the odds were against her. She'd be proud of Jake, catching Helen in the act like a little detective. I saved the video to my laptop, sent a copy to Peter, and started planning my next move. Helen thought she could intimidate me, but she'd just given me the weapon I needed. I wasn't just fighting for my hens, I was fighting for justice. But would the board care about Jake's video, or would Helen find a way to twist the truth? Peter's knock came just as I was putting Jake to bed. His urgency pulled me outside, where a small group of neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins, the Thompsons, and Lisa, stood huddled in the dim street light. "Stormy's honks are a wake-up call," Peter said, his voice low but firm. "We're done with Helen's tyranny," Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her usual warmth replaced with steel. "She fined me for my mailbox last year, said it was too reflective. I paid to avoid trouble, but I'm done." The Thompsons chimed in, their voices rising. "She threatened us over our dogs barking, even though he's quieter than her car alarm." Lisa, usually shy, pulled out her phone. "I'll record too. She banned my flower bed for being too vibrant. It's time she stopped." By morning, I had a stack of video testimonies, each one a dagger aimed at Helen's reign. Their stories fueled my hope but also my fear. If Helen got wind of this, she'd come for all of us. The neighborhood was uniting, but the stakes were higher than ever. Would our voices be enough to topple her? Stormy's chase on day 3 was the talk of Cedar Hollow. I'd been sipping coffee on my porch when I heard her honk, louder, angrier than ever. I looked up just in time to see Helen leading a couple in suits across her lawn, her clipboard in hand, her smile forced. Stormy burst from my yard like a feathered missile, wings flapping, honking like a possessed foghorn. Helen froze, her eyes wide with terror, before she bolted, her heels sinking into the grass, her clipboard flying. The clients doubled over, clutching their sides as they laughed, while Stormy chased her halfway down the street, her honks echoing triumphantly. I nearly spat out my coffee, torn between shock and glee. Jake ran out, cheering, "Go, Stormy!" Neighbors peeked out their windows, some laughing, others clapping. For the first time, Helen looked powerless, her perfect image shattered by a goose with a vendetta. But as I laughed, a chill crept in. Helen wouldn't let this humiliation slide. Stormy had made her mark, but she'd also made an enemy. When the HOA email arrived, I sat at my kitchen table, rereading it to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Upon review, a small number of hens are permitted. The goose must be removed due to noise violations. Relief flooded me. My hens were safe, Mom's legacy secure. Jake whooped when I told him, his grin lighting up the room. But as I looked at Stormy, strutting in the backyard, I felt a pang of unease. Helen had lost this battle, but she wasn't the type to surrender. I'd seen the fury in her eyes, the way she'd stormed off after Stormy's chase. Margaret's visit had hinted at a board divided. Some supported me, but others likely backed Helen. What if she had allies ready to strike back? I thought of Jake's footage, the neighbors' testimonies, powerful but not foolproof. Helen could twist the narrative, claim I'd provoked her. The victory felt fragile, like walking on thin ice. I'd won this round, but the war wasn't over. What would she do now that I'd humiliated her? I was loading Stormy into my car to take her back to the farm when a screech of tires shattered the morning calm. Helen's black sedan roared into my driveway, kicking up gravel. She stormed out, her face a deep red, papers clutched like a weapon. "This isn't over," she shouted, waving them wildly. "I've called an emergency meeting tonight. I've got proof. Chickens ruin property values." I stayed calm, a smile tugging at my lip. "The board emailed me last night." "My hens are cleared," I said, holding her gaze. "Check your inbox." Her eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Before she could retort, I added, "This is being recorded," pointing to my doorbell camera. The lens gleamed under the morning sun, a silent witness to her unraveling. She froze, her papers trembling in her hands. This was her last stand, and I could see the panic setting in. What would she do now that her power was slipping? "You can't record me," Helen stammered, her voice cracking as she glared at the camera. "It's my property," I replied coolly, "and Oregon's a one-party consent state. You're fair game." Her face paled, her composure crumbling. I pressed on. "I've been looking into the Property Management Association's ethics rules. They don't take kindly to using HOA power for personal gain, like boosting your business." Her eyes darted, fear replacing her fury. That night, my phone pinged with a neighborhood-wide email from the HOA treasurer. It announced Helen's removal as president, effective immediately, after the board reviewed my doorbell footage, Jake's video of her sabotage, and the neighbors' testimonies. The email detailed her abuse of power, targeting properties for her management company. Her firm launched an internal investigation, and her certification with the Property Management Association was under review. I stared at the screen, hardly believing it. Helen's reign was over, but the weight of her actions lingered. What had she done to others that we didn't know about? The next morning, I fed my hens, Clara, Ada, Florence, and Grace, watching them cluck contentedly in their coop. Across the street, Helen loaded boxes into her sedan, her movements jerky with frustration. Margaret stopped by, her dog tugging at the leash. "She targeted properties to manage," Margaret said, her voice low. "Harassed owners to sell, funneled clients to her firm. Your footage was the tipping point." I nodded, glancing at Helen as she hauled another box. She caught my eye, her facade cracking, first with fury, then a flicker of fear. Without a word, she shoved the box into her car, slammed the door, and sped off, tires squealing. Cedar Hollow was free, my hens and Mom's legacy were safe. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood waking up to a new dawn. But as I watched her taillights fade, I wondered what secrets she'd left behind. This wasn't just about chickens. It was about standing up to bullies. Together. Stormy's honks had united us, turning fear into courage. My fight wasn't just for me, it was for Mom, for Jake, for every neighbor Helen had silenced. What else had she hidden, and how would Cedar Hollow change now that her shadow was gone? The victory tasted sweet, but it came with a promise to stay vigilant. If you believe in justice like I do, if Helen's tyranny shocked you or Stormy's chaos made you cheer, hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel for more stories of standing up to HOA madness, and let's keep fighting for what's right. Comment below, what's the worst rule you've faced? Together we can build a community where fairness wins. See you next time. As Helen stormed toward me, papers flapping, I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with dread. Her red face and wild eyes reminded me of a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. I kept my voice steady, but inside my heart pounded. When I mentioned the board's email, her shock was almost satisfying. Almost. The moment I pointed to the doorbell camera, I saw the shift. Her confidence faltered, her hands shaking as she realized I'd turned her own tactics against her. I thought of Mom, her strength in her final days, and it steadied me. She'd faced worse than Helen's wrath, and I could too. But, as Helen's voice cracked, I felt a twinge of pity, quickly replaced by resolve. She'd brought this on herself with her sabotage, her fines, her control. I saved the footage, knowing it could be the final blow. The air between us crackled with tension. Would she lash out again, or had I finally broken her hold? I stood tall, ready for whatever came next. That night, my phone buzzed non-stop with texts and calls. Mrs. Jenkins sent a thumbs-up emoji. Peter called to cheer, and even the Thompsons left a voicemail laughing about Stormy's chase. The neighborhood buzzed with relief and excitement. Helen's reign had ended, and they felt it too. I stepped outside, and a few neighbors waved from their porches, their smiles brighter than I'd seen in months. "We did it," Peter said, clapping my shoulder as he passed by with a six-pack. "She thought she could rule us forever," Margaret texted later. "The board's shaken, some are grateful, others scared she'll retaliate." I felt a surge of pride, knowing Jake's quick thinking and the neighbors' courage had turned the tide, but the victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone she'd oppressed. I wondered how many more stories would surface now that her power was gone. The community was waking up, but the scars she'd left might take time to heal. Watching Helen load her car, I felt a mix of triumph and unease. Her movements were frantic, boxes spilling as she shoved them in, her usual poise replaced by desperation. Margaret's revelation about her targeting properties hit hard. She'd turned Cedar Hollow into her personal empire. I thought of the fines, the threats, the sabotage. How many families had she forced out? As she drove off, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. Kids played in the street, their laughter echoing where her silence once reigned. I fed my hens, their clucks a soothing rhythm. and whispered to them, "We made it, Mom." Jake joined me, hugging my side. "She's gone, Dad," he said, grinning. I nodded, but my mind lingered on Margaret's words. Helen's departure was a victory, but her influence might linger. What deals had she made, what secrets buried? The freedom felt real but fragile, earned through struggle, not given. Standing with Jake, I felt Mom's presence stronger than ever. Those hens weren't just birds, they were her gift, a lifeline through my darkest days. Winning this fight meant honoring her, proving I could stand tall like she did. But it also meant a new beginning for Cedar Hollow. The neighbors' unity, sparked by Stormy, showed me what we could achieve together. I thought of the planters Helen had banned, the dogs she'd silenced. Maybe they'd return now. The email from the HOA hinted at a special election, a chance to rebuild fairly. I smiled at Jake, imagining a neighborhood where kids could play, hens could cluck, and no one lived in fear. Helen's exit was a start, but the real work was ahead. What else would we uncover, and how would we shape this freedom? The future felt bright, but I knew vigilance was key.